The year was 1942. The world was at war. Every ocean, every jungle, every stretch of desert on Earth had become a place where men were trying to defeat other men. The news moved slowly in those days, carried by radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines that arrived a day late and told half the truth. Ordinary people at home read what they could and tried to understand a war that was happening thousands of miles away, on islands with names they had never heard before and could not pronounce. Then one of those names became famous. There is a small island in the Pacific Ocean that most people cannot find on a map. It is covered in thick jungle, cut through by muddy rivers, and surrounded by water that turns dark green under cloudy skies. The island is called Guadalcanal. It is not a beautiful place. The air is heavy with heat and moisture. Insects are everywhere. The ground is soft and wet. And yet, in the autumn of 1942, this small, sweaty island became one of the most important places on Earth, because both America and Japan understood one simple truth. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal controlled the sky over the Pacific. And whoever controlled the sky could win the war. This is a story about a machine gun. But more than that, it is a story about what happens when an enemy underestimates a man who has spent his entire life learning one single skill better than anyone else in the world. John Basilone was born on November 4, 1916, in Buffalo, New York. He was the sixth of 10 children in an Italian-American family. His father was a tailor. The family was not wealthy. John left school after the 8th grade, when he was 15 years old, and started working as a golf caddy at the local country club. He was a quiet boy who did not talk much but watched everything carefully. He had strong hands and steady eyes. He was not the type of boy who dreamed of becoming famous. He was the type of boy who simply wanted to be good at something. At 18 years old, he joined the United States Army. The Army sent him to the Philippine Islands, a tropical chain of islands near Japan, where American soldiers were stationed at the time. It was there that John Basilone learned to shoot. Not the basic shooting that every soldier learns, the kind where you point a weapon at a target and hope for the best. He learned the other kind. The patient kind. The kind where you study a weapon so deeply that you understand every small movement it makes, every tiny vibration, every change in its behavior as the barrel grows warm from use. He spent hours on the firing range long after other soldiers had gone to eat or sleep. His fellow soldiers called him Manila John, a nickname that came from his time in the Philippines, and it stuck with him for the rest of his life. When his time in the Army ended in 1937, he went back to New Jersey and worked as a truck driver. But civilian life felt quiet in a way that did not suit him. He thought about the ranges. He thought about the guns. In July 1940, he walked into a recruiting office in Baltimore, Maryland, and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. This decision would change the course of a battle, and the battle would change the course of a war. On the other side of the Pacific, Japan had been at war for years. The Imperial Japanese military was experienced, disciplined, and deeply proud. By 1942, Japanese forces had swept across much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They had taken island after island with speed and confidence. Their soldiers were trained to fight with intensity and to never stop advancing. Japanese military commanders studied their enemies carefully. They read reports. They examined equipment. They calculated. And when it came to American machine guns, their conclusion was reasonable, logical, and completely wrong. In the summer of 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal and quickly captured the airfield that Japanese construction workers had been building there. The Americans renamed it Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot who had been killed at the Battle of Midway. This airfield was everything. Aircraft flying from Henderson Field could threaten Japanese ships, Japanese supply lines, and Japanese bases across hundreds of miles of ocean. Japan could not allow America to keep it. They sent ships, aircraft, and thousands of soldiers. They were going to take it back. While Japanese commanders planned their counterattack, they carefully reviewed what they knew about American defensive weapons. The heavy machine gun the Marines were using was the Browning M1917, a water-cooled, tripod-mounted weapon that fired .30 caliber rounds. Japanese military planners looked at this gun and made their calculations. The machine gun, in standard military use at that time, was a weapon of suppression. You did not use it like a rifle. You used it like a garden hose, sweeping it across an area, laying down a wall of bullets, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down while your own forces moved forward. At long range, it was loud and frightening, but not reliably deadly against individual targets. The Japanese knew this. Every military in the world knew this. It was in the textbooks. It was standard doctrine. So Japanese commanders planned their attack with that understanding in mind. At certain distances, the American machine guns would be dangerous but manageable. The plan was to advance in strong numbers, accept some losses at close range where the guns were most effective, and overwhelm the American positions by sheer force of numbers. They had done this before. It had worked before. They had no reason to believe it would not work again. They had never met John Basilone. By October 1942, Basilone was a sergeant in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, positioned as part of the defensive line protecting Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. He had 15 men under his command. They were dug into the jungle along a narrow stretch of ground near the Lunga River. The night air was thick and hot. Rain had turned the ground soft beneath their boots. Somewhere out in the darkness beyond their position, several thousand Japanese soldiers were moving through the jungle, getting into place. The Japanese force that night was roughly 3,000 men from the Imperial Army Sendai Division, commanded by experienced officers who believed the operation was going to succeed. Their confidence was not arrogance, it was based on careful calculation. They had the numbers. They had the planning. They had the element of the night. Their soldiers were willing to advance into gunfire without flinching. This was going to work. At approximately midnight on October 24, 1942, the attack began. The first wave of Japanese soldiers moved toward the American lines. The jungle erupted with noise, rifle fire, grenades, mortar rounds dropping out of the dark sky. Basilone's machine gun sections opened fire. What happened next is the part that no Japanese military calculation had prepared for. Basilone did not sweep the gun. He did not spray. He placed each burst the way a carpenter places a nail, deliberate, precise, aimed at a specific location based on specific knowledge. He had spent years learning how his weapon behaved at distance. He knew how the gun shot at 200 yards, at 400 yards, at 600 yards. He knew how to adjust for the heat that built up in the barrel after sustained firing and changed where the rounds landed. He knew how to read the sounds of approaching men in the dark and translate that sound into a direction and a distance. He could do what military textbooks said could not be reliably done with a machine gun. He could aim it, at long range, with the precision of a rifle. The first wave of Japanese soldiers was stopped. The second wave came. It was stopped. Japanese mortar rounds began falling on the American position. One of Basilone's machine gun sections was hit. The gun went silent. The men operating it were down. A gap had opened in the defensive line, and through that gap, hundreds of Japanese soldiers could pour in and reach Henderson Field. If that happened, the airfield could be lost. If the airfield was lost, the position on Guadalcanal could be lost. The calculations would all be reversed. Basilone did not wait. He picked up 100 pounds of machine gun equipment and extra ammunition belts and ran. Not walked. Ran. 200 yards through open ground while mortar rounds were landing around him and rifle fire was crossing the space he moved through. He reached the silenced gun position, set up the weapon, and opened fire again, closing the gap in the line before Japanese soldiers could push through it. Then he went back. He found another gun that had jammed. The mechanism had failed under the stress of continuous firing. He repaired it under fire. Under fire. With bullets landing nearby, in the dark, with hands that knew this weapon so well that they could fix it without pausing to think. Then he manned that gun himself. The waves kept coming. One after another through that long night, the Japanese soldiers advanced and were turned back. At some point, Basilone lost his protective gloves, the asbestos gloves that Marines wore to handle the machine gun barrels, which grew burning hot during extended use. It did not stop him. He grabbed the barrel with his bare hands when he needed to, burning his skin, and kept firing. Fellow Marine Nash Phillips, who lost a hand in the same battle, later remembered Basilone's appearance by the time dawn approached. He described a man who had not slept, had not eaten, was barefoot, with red eyes and a face darkened by gunpowder and smoke, who came to check on his wounded men with a pistol tucked in his belt and genuine concern on his face. When the last ammunition belt ran out just before dawn, Basilone used what he had, a pistol and a machete, and held his position until help arrived. By the time the sun came up over Guadalcanal on October 25, 1942, the Japanese assault force that had attacked Henderson Field had been largely destroyed. More than 900 soldiers from a 3,000-man force lay dead in front of the American lines. An entire regiment, confidently assembled and carefully planned, had been turned back by a small group of Marines. At the center of that defense, through the entire night, had been one man who understood his weapon better than the people who designed it understood it. The Japanese officers who wrote their reports afterward noted something that confused them. The American machine gun fire had been too accurate. It had engaged targets at distances where the weapon should not have been effective as a precision instrument. It had not behaved the way their intelligence said it would behave. They had planned for a wall of general fire. What they had received was something closer to precise, calculated, individual targeting, as if each burst had been aimed by a marksman who could see in the dark. They were not wrong. That is exactly what it was. John Basilone received the Medal of Honor for his actions on the night of October 24 to 25, 1942. It was presented to him in a ceremony in May 1943, making him the first enlisted Marine to receive America's highest military honor during the Second World War. He stood on a platform and heard his actions described in formal language: extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty. He listened politely. When it was his turn to speak, he said something simple and honest. He said that only part of the medal belonged to him. The rest of it, he said, belonged to the men who were still on Guadalcanal. America brought him home and made him a symbol. He toured the country, appeared at events, helped raise money for the war effort. People lined up to shake the hand of Manila John. Newspapers printed his photograph. He was celebrated in exactly the way that a nation at war needs to celebrate its heroes, loudly, publicly, hopefully. He hated it. Not because he was ungrateful. Not because he was modest in a performance sort of way. He hated it because his men were still fighting, and he was standing in banquet halls eating food from plates. He requested to return to combat. The Marine Corps said no. He requested again. And again. Eventually, they said yes. In 1944, John Basilone married a Marine sergeant named Lena Riggi. It was a good marriage between two people who understood what service meant. She knew, and he knew, that he was going back. That was the nature of who he was. He could not be anything else. On February 19, 1945, American forces landed on the island of Iwo Jima in one of the most intense battles of the entire Pacific War. John Basilone landed with them on the beach. Within hours, his unit was pinned down by Japanese fire from a fortified position. Basilone moved to organize the men around him, to push them forward off the exposed beach. He yelled at them to follow him. He had done this before. He knew how to do this. He was 32 years old and he had been doing this since he was a young man in the Philippines who stayed at the firing range long after everyone else had gone home. A mortar round landed near him. He was gone within hours of reaching Iwo Jima, on the first day of a battle that would last 36 days. He received the Navy Cross posthumously. Lena Riggi Basilone, his wife of just a few months, received the news and received the medal and kept on living with the weight of both. The story of that night on Guadalcanal is remembered in different ways by different people. Military historians study it as an example of what determined defensive positions can accomplish against superior numbers. Marine Corps instructors use it as a teaching example of weapon mastery and leadership under pressure. Students of World War II look at it as one of the turning points of the Pacific Campaign, because Henderson Field held, and because Henderson Field held, the Cactus Air Force kept flying, and because the Cactus Air Force kept flying, Japanese naval operations in the surrounding waters became more and more dangerous, and slowly, the whole equation of the Pacific War began to shift. But there is something smaller and quieter in the story too. Something that gets lost when we talk about tactics and campaigns and turning points. John Basilone was a boy who left school at 15 and went to work as a caddy at a golf club. He joined the army because he wanted something more than driving a truck. He found it at the firing range, that particular silence that falls over a person when they are doing the one thing they were built to do. He spent years practicing something that his superiors told him was not strictly necessary to master at the level he was mastering it. Machine guns were for suppression, not precision. Everyone knew that. He kept practicing anyway. There is something in that worth pausing over. The gap between what a tool is supposed to do and what a person can make it do, with enough patience and enough practice and enough genuine love for the doing of it, is sometimes enormous. John Basilone did not have more firepower than the Japanese forces that came at him on the night of October 24. He was not more numerous. He was not better supplied. He had been awake for a very long time, in a hot jungle, eating whatever was available, getting rained on, and listening to the sounds of a war that had been going on since before he arrived. What he had was knowledge. Specific, deep, personal, unrepeatable knowledge of one weapon and what it could do in the hands of someone who had decided to understand it completely. The Japanese commanders had planned for an American machine gun. They had not planned for Manila John. That distinction, between the weapon and the person who has truly mastered it, ended up meaning everything. Somewhere in the Pacific, on a small island covered in jungle that most people still cannot find on a map, that distinction held a defensive line for an entire night, turned back 3,000 men, and kept an airfield in American hands long enough to matter. The gun was just a gun. The man was something else entirely. Today, there is a statue of John Basilone in Raritan, New Jersey, the town where he grew up. He stands in bronze, larger than life, holding a machine gun. People walk past it every day on their way to work or the grocery store or wherever ordinary life is taking them. Some of them stop and look at it. Some of them read the small marker near the base that tells a shortened version of the story. Very few of them fully understand what that bronze figure represents, not just courage, which is the word we usually reach for when we talk about soldiers, but something more specific and harder to name. The understanding that comes from years of doing one thing, quietly, without recognition, until the day arrives when it turns out to matter more than anyone expected. John Basilone spent years at firing ranges that did not keep records of what he was learning. He practiced precision that the military did not officially require of him. He mastered a weapon beyond the level any training program demanded. He did these things not because someone told him to, but because that is the kind of man he was, the kind who is not satisfied with good enough, who keeps going long after the task is technically complete, who finds something in the doing of a difficult thing that other people cannot quite see or measure. That invisible work, done in the years before Guadalcanal, is what saved Henderson Field. The night itself was one night. But the preparation for that night was a lifetime.